Hi, I'm Rohit, and welcome to the Bhagavad Gita. Today we're going to do the introduction, where you learn about the Vedas, the Mahabharata, Hinduism, the entire background of the Bhagavad Gita. And I want to just thank you for being here and welcome you to this incredible journey that we're going to take as we go through all the chapters of the Bhagavad Gita, as we dive deep into the complexities and the deeper meanings and the significance and the practical application of this incredible spiritual text that has been around for thousands of years. So let's begin with taking a look at what this is all about. It starts with the Vedas and the Mahabharata, which is part of the Vedas. So for us, for all of you who are new to the concept, let me begin by something very, very familiar. You've all heard about the term Hinduism, and you would think that all of this is some Hindu philosophy or Hindu spirituality. But in fact, at the time when the Vedas were written, the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, there was no such thing as the word Hindu. You might be surprised to learn that. There are, in fact, about 1.5 billion people across the world who currently identify with being Hindu, but in fact, the term was given by Muslim invaders in 6 BC. It's what I've been able to gather, who referred to the people who lived across the Indus River as Hindus. So they couldn't pronounce the word Hindu. They used the word Sindhu, and then from Sindhu they got Hindu, and it's just kind of a big mishmash. It was only later that the British formalized the spirituality of India and gave it the official name Hinduism. But as such, in the so-called Hindu scriptures, there is no such term at all, never, nowhere. There is the term Sanatana Dharma, which means the eternal dharma of humanity, the eternal nature of the human being. And that's what we're here to really discover. But during the time of the British, there was a big campaign to turn the entire Indian spirituality into something redundant, something unimportant. They began to label it as mythology, and even till today you'll hear of many Indians who think of their scriptures and spirituality as mythology. I wish it wasn't the case, but if you go back all the way to 1835, Lord Macaulay's address to the British Parliament. Now, I don't know if this is 100% true, and whether it happened. Some people contest the validity of what I'm going to read to you right now. But others, well, I think you can just look at the outcomes that were created in present time and in the last 100 years or so that the British were here in India. And you'll see that what is quoted here is pretty accurate. So Lord Macaulay, according to this quote, in his address to the British Parliament said, "I have travelled across the length and breadth of India, and I have not seen one person who is a beggar or a thief. Such wealth I have seen in this country, such high moral values, people of such caliber, that I do not think we can ever conquer this country. There is only one way, and that is by breaking the very backbone of its ancient spiritual and cultural heritage. Therefore, I propose that we replace her ancient education system. When they lose their self-esteem, their self-worth, the entire race will become whatever we want to make them, a slave nation." So these were the grand objectives of the British when they invaded India and colonized it. But after India gained freedom, it's been a big struggle for people to really get to understand their own culture and their spirituality. And this attempt at going through the Bhagavad Gita and presenting it to you here is an attempt to try to revive that ancient wisdom for the benefit of people all across the world, for you to know that there is something so incredible to be learned out here that has been forgotten over time. So the Vedas, I'd like to point them to you, is the word Veda, Veda, means knowledge or wisdom. They are referred to as being aparusheya, which means not of man. That means received originally through wise people, saints, people who were deep in meditation. And in that meditative state, they were able to hear these incredible words of wisdom, and then they actually would recite them orally. It was an oral tradition that was passed down from one person to the next, to the next, to the next, over thousands of years. It is said, in fact, that the original Vedas were spoken to Brahma, the person who is in charge of the creation of this universe. The Vedas don't see God as the creator. They see that God delegates that responsibility to various devas or demigods. We'll talk about them in a little bit, who then in turn carry out the functions of managing the universe. So the Vedas are therefore an oral tradition that was handed down, referred to as Shruti. And it was only in around 3000 BCE, or about 5,000 years ago, when the wise, saintly people of that time were able to foresee the emergence of something called Kali Yuga, which means the age of quarrel, hypocrisy, and dissension, that this time was about to begin 5,000 years ago. It is then that they decided that because people would have short memories, because people would not be as intelligent, because people would not have the wisdom and the capacity in the time that was to come, all of this needed to be written down. So the Vedas were for the first time written down by Vyasa. Vyasadev, as he is called, became the person who compiled what are effectively thousands of books of knowledge and wisdom. And it's a fascinating read if you have the time to go through it. But I'm going to kind of bring you down to the sort of essence, the core of the Vedic wisdom. So let's take a look at how it all sort of began. The initial part of the Vedas was known as the Rig Veda and the Yajur Veda, the Sam Veda, the Atharva Veda. And in these, there was worship of nature and the demigods. There were rituals and sacrifices and hymns and prayers, because people were just discovering that there were these incredible forces of nature that was so powerful that human beings had to learn to work with it. They could not tame it. They could not tame the weather. They could not tame the rain, the wind, the sun, the seasons, and the things that were needed for the crops and for human well-being. So they learned to honor nature. They figured that behind nature there had to be something. So therefore came the idea of the Devas, Deva. The Devas, or demigods as they're called, and some of the main ones are like Brahma, Shiva, Vishnu, and beyond that you have Lakshmi and Saraswati and Parvati, and you have so many different names of different Devas. All of them are in charge of different aspects, like of the creation. So some you might even think of them as alien beings. And basically, but they are powerful souls just like us, who are born and who die. They are not immortal. They are in charge of managing the universe. They have mystical powers, and it has been said that there are 33 million such demigods. Now, they are the equivalent of what you'd have in Parliament, Congress, where you have, government, and they're the ones who sort of manage that government. So that's the basic idea behind that. I haven't met any of them, but I know that they're very popular. They are prayed to. There are temples to them. There's worship for them. There's all kinds of stuff. And much of the rituals and the prayers in the Vedas are to the Devas. In time, there emerged a deeper understanding that the head, or the main Devas, the Trinity as one might call it, were Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Brahma was in charge of creation. He's on the left. Vishnu was in charge of maintenance of the universe. And Shiva was in charge of destruction of the universe. Now, that's not all that they're capable of. They're way more incredible beings than that, but that's some of the function that they are known to have. And each universe has its own Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. So that's another interesting thing to understand. As there are millions and millions of universes, there are also millions and millions of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. But then emerged the understanding of what might be referred to as, or is referred to rather, as the absolute truth. And that concept, Param Satyam, is the term used in the Srimad Bhagavat, where they talk about this notion of the absolute truth. And this became the philosophy, the spirituality of the Upanishads. It then carried over into the Mahabharata and later on into the Srimad Bhagavatam. Now, these are all texts that we'll explore in time. And at this point, I'm just going to mention the names, that's it. But what they did in these texts was they began the exploration of the nature of the absolute truth or God. They first began to discover God as an all-pervading energy that was all over the universe. Now, this idea of energy is something that Einstein talked about in very recent times, even 100 years ago or less. But this was known to the ancients of the Vedic period thousands of years ago. I mean, as I said, the Vedas were written 5,000 years ago, but they were known for thousands, tens of thousands of years before that. It is said even from the moment of creation, they were being handed down as instructions for human beings to follow. So, moving from there, they began to talk about God as three aspects of God. They discovered that God is everywhere, and that they broke it down, the presence of God, they broke into three parts. The first they called Brahman, the energy of the universe that was everywhere. The second they referred to as Param Atma, the great soul. There was the Atma, which was the soul, which was like you and me, all of us, we are spiritual beings, and therefore souls. The word for soul in Sanskrit is Atma, or Atman, as some people say, with an N at the end. And they then talked of the super soul or the Param Atma being present in everyone. So along with the soul was present the Param Atma. Along with the Atma was the Paramatma, who was the supreme being present in everyone. God present in every one of us. That doesn't make us God. It simply means that God is present within every one of us, within every creature for that matter, and within all of us. So, and then there was the idea of Bhagavan, God as the supreme being, masculine and feminine, beautiful and gorgeous, incredibly charming, incredibly adorable, and manifesting sometimes as a child, sometimes as an adult, sometimes as a simple little cowherd boy, and sometimes as a king. So having various incarnations over the ages, Bhagavan would appear and grace us with his and her presence. So those were the basic ideas of the Vedic time. And the philosophies that emerged from there could be broken down into two parts. The first of them was known as Advaita, right? Advaita means non-dual. That is the idea of God as energy. And the second concept that emerged from there was that of bhakti, and that is of God as a being or a person. Now, what is interesting about this is that for literally hundreds, maybe thousands of years, deeply spiritual people who followed the Vedas would argue about this dichotomy. They would say, no, God is an energy, and it is from the energy, from this energy that we came, and to this energy we will go back and merge into it. And this concept has become very popular in today's time, the idea of merging back into the oneness. But this was known for thousands of years before in the Vedic times. And It's where it originates, this concept. But they also thought of the different forms of God that came, the incarnations, the avatars, as coming from the light, and then the form emerged from that. They referred to God as not only energy, but as being formless, without any attributes or any qualities. But then there also emerged the understanding of bhakti, of God as a person, of God not only as a person, but a person with whom you could have a relationship that was based on love, a person who would be there for you, who you could talk to, who you could listen to, who you could literally have a connection with and fall in love with. So these people who believed in bhakti felt that the energy came, or the light came, from the person God. And so this argument would take place and took place for a long time. It was only in recent times that it began to be resolved. And I'll tell you about that in just a minute. But some of the main proponents of the Advaita philosophy, the non-dual philosophy, were Shankaracharya, Buddha, Mahavir, as well as the Dalai Lama today. And Buddhism is basically derived from that, and so is much of modern day spirituality. And the process within the Advaita philosophy is one of meditation, of stillness, of presence, of yoga, of contemplation, austerity, renunciation. These are all the different processes mentioned in the Vedanta Sutra, as it is called. And on bhakti, on the other hand, came the idea of the personal God. Now, this is something that has also been imitated by many people who want to call themselves God. They will call themselves Bhagavan. Many gurus and teachers along the way called themselves God. And then you had many who took the teachers who didn't call themselves God and elevated them to the level of God and said, no, my teacher is God. My Messiah, my Guru is God. And I think a better way to understand it would be when you look at the definition given in the Vedas. They refer to Bhagavan, or God, as being one who possesses all knowledge, all fame, all beauty, all wealth, all strength, and all detachment. In other words, all knowledge means knows everything. All fame means is famous everywhere, no matter by whatever name you call God. Is the epitome of beauty, not some old man sitting in the clouds. And has all wealth, means owns everything, has the most incredible strength. No being is able to kill or destroy God, and is completely detached from it all. Now, if some being you come across, whether it's a teacher, a guru, a messiah, or whatever messenger, can say that they have all these qualities, then they would qualify as God. But rarely has that been the case, except, as we'll find out in the Bhagavad Gita. So there's also two forms of connection with God that I think are very important to understand on the bhakti path. And that is the understanding that some people have, which is that God is great. And that creates a very formal, conditional relationship in which you have to appease God. You have to prove yourself worthy. You have to do all kinds of rituals, and you have to do all kinds of things to be able to become worthy of the kingdom of God, as some people would say. But on the other hand, there is the concept of God as the beloved. This is talked about in Sufism, it is talked about in bhakti, and it is talked about amongst the Christian mystics as well. Here is a feeling of unconditional, intimate, loving relationship with God. In this, there is no thing to be proved. There is nothing to be worthy. Every one of us is worthy. Every one of us is deserving, and every one of us is beloved of God. And the relationship that can be had here can be as intimate as you desire. It can be the relationship of a friend, of a lover, of even a parent to God. You don't just have to be the child of God. You could be the parent of God and taking care of God and worrying about Him. So these are things that are exhibited in the pastimes and lila of Krishna. And you'll come across that at some point. We'll talk about it more as we go along. The processes in bhakti are devotion, worship, surrender. There's also a lot of dance and music and feasting, and the focus is on love, romance, and sensuality. It's a wonderful path and has been my personal favorite over the ages. Although I find it very useful to be able to learn from both sides. I find that if I listen to what the followers of Advaita have to teach and what the followers of Bhakti have to teach, when I bring those two teachings together, it becomes a richer experience of spirituality. I don't have to limit myself to any one or the other. This same idea was brought up by Chaitanya, who expounded the idea 500 years ago of achintya bhed abhed tattva, which means that we are inconceivably, simultaneously one with and different from God. Right? He resolved the dilemma of this argument. Are we one with God or are we different from God? Is God a person or is God an energy? And by saying that, in fact, God is both. God is neither this nor that, but is in fact all of everything you could ever conceive of. And that made a lot more sense to me. And so that's the perspective from which I will be sharing with you the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. So, to be very clear, to sum that up, God is both non-dual and dual, has form and is formless, has attributes and no attributes, is a localized person and a universal energy that is spread everywhere. And if you can't wrap your head around that, and if that doesn't make any sense to you, hey, you're in the perfect place. That's exactly where we want to go. We call that zero, shunya. The mind no longer works. The mind no longer is able to understand. It is not able to comprehend. How can something have form and yet be formless? How can it have attributes and yet have no attributes? How can it be everywhere and yet be somewhere? But that is the very nature of God. If you want to step into the unknown, the unlimited, and that which is incomprehensible, you have to go past the mind and tap into a higher wisdom. And that higher wisdom is what we're going to work on learning, how to be able to access, because it takes us into something that our small little minds cannot grasp. You want to go into the infinity? Then zero is equal to infinity, right? Plus 1 minus 1 equals to 0. And 0 is equal to infinity. So we want to open the doorways of infinity for you. Another way to say that might be, this and its opposite are simultaneously true. And as your mind quiets down, as it's not able to follow this, as it begins to look and grasp, let it settle. Let it settle down. As the mind quiets, you will awaken a higher, deeper understanding of spirituality. Welcome on this path, because there is so much to discover here as we go forward. So the next part of what I'm going to talk to you about is the Mahabharat. The Mahabharat is perhaps one of the most incredible works that has ever been written, besides the Vedas, of course. And it was, the Bhagavad Gita is a tiny part of the Mahabharat, which is why this becomes relevant. It was compiled by Vyasa, again at the time of compiling the Vedas, 3000 BC, in the ancient Sanskrit language. It has 100,000 verses and 200,000 lines and 2 million words. It is 12 times the size of the Bible. And that's just the Mahabharat. The Mahabharat, as I said, is a tiny part of the Vedas. But it's a fascinating story containing within it the deepest philosophy, that of the Bhagavad Gita. So it begins with a king, as all stories do. And this king is the king of Hastinapur, which is currently known as New Delhi, India. Well, actually, it would probably be more like Old Delhi, India. So he is the king of Hastinapur, and his name is Vichitra Virya. Names are not that important out here, but try and follow the story. And he dies at a very young age, leaving both his wives childless. Yes, at that time it was okay. A person could have more than one wife, but that was provided they could support them. And so now when he dies, his mother, the queen mother, Satyavati, before getting... So there's a huge dilemma going on here. I think, let me back up a little bit. There's a big dilemma. He has died. The king has died. His newly married wives are childless. And as a result of which, there is no heir to the throne. So the queen mother, Satyavati, remembers something that had happened before she got married. She had had a son with a great sage, Parashar Muni. And this son's name was Vyasa. She had not been able to keep him because as a unmarried mother, it was not permitted in that time for her to be able to continue to keep the baby. No one would have married her in that case. So it was just a different culture, a different time. Anyways, Vyasa grew up to be the author of the Vedas and was a very wise, deeply saintly, renounced person. So she called on Vyasa, and he had said to her, whenever you need me, call me and I'll be there. He called on him and said, listen, I have a favor from you. My sons, she had two sons, they have both died. One had died in a battle, the other died of, Vichitravirya died of some disease. And we don't have an heir to the throne. I need you as my son to impregnate his widowed queens. And the sage complied. The queens complied. They went along with it because it was for the greater good of the kingdom. And each of them bore a son. One of the sons was called Dhritarashtra. He was born blind. So you will often hear me referring to him as the blind king. The other son, his name was Pandu. Pandu had ill health. Oh, quite a complicated situation. Pandu grew to be a great warrior and was loved by everyone. But as all good stories go, and as and by the way, these are actually not stories. They are meant to be Puranas. They're meant to be histories of ancient times. So these are the recording of those histories. And that's what we're reading. So I don't want you to, when I say as stories go, I feel that life is a story and it's full of so many ups and downs and so many things that we need to learn. So in that context, I use the word story, though these are in fact histories. So Pandu was once out hunting, and on his hunt he killed a deer. What he didn't know was that the deer that he saw was actually a hermit couple that lived in the forest, and they were making love. And to disguise themselves, they had created an illusion of a deer being there. Pandu had shot the deer, thinking it was a deer, and it in fact killed this couple. They had been wounded deeply, and they cursed Pandu before they died that if ever he tried to have sex, he would die. Now at this point, Pandu also had no kids from either of his wives, Kunti and Madri. And we had, again, a very big dilemma. This is the scene that unfolded here as Pandu shot the couple. So Kunti, one of the wives of Pandu, had received a boon from another great saintly person, Durvasha, that she could recite a mantra and call on any demigod to bear his child. Pandu, when he heard about this, the husband, when he heard about it, he was overjoyed, and he asked her to go ahead and give the kingdom its future kings. So in other words, she was going to call on these demigods to be able to give her a child. So this is her calling on one of the demigods, and who appears to her, and that very night a child is born. The story goes forward, and now she gives to Pandu the son that was born. The first of these children was called Yudhishthir. Yudhishthir was an incredible being. He was known as he was the son of Dharma, the god of righteousness, and he grew up to become the embodiment of virtue, truth, and patience. She then had another son, and this time with Vayu, the god of the wind, and this son was named Bhima or Bhimsen. Bhim grew up to become incredibly strong and undefeatable. Then Kunti had a third son. This was the son of the Deva, the king of the Devas, the king of the demigods, Indra. And this son was called Arjun. Arjun became the greatest warrior and archer of his time. Now the second wife, Madri, felt very left out. She didn't have any children either. So for her sake, Kunti called on the Ashwinis. They were the twins, and through them were born Nakul and Sahadev. So now Pandu effectively had 5 sons: Yudhishthir, Bhim, Arjun, Nakul, and Sahadev. These are going to be the heroes of our story going forward. And they're going to be the good guys. They're going to be the ones that we're going to be looking at, through whose lens we're going to be looking at the story of the Mahabharata. Now comes a very unfortunate moment where Pandu was unable to resist. Despite having been told that he will die if he tries to have sex, he ended up having sex with his wife Madri, and he died in her arms. Madri, unable to bear the guilt and sorrow of his death, flung herself into the funeral pyre, while Kunti took the 5 sons of Pandu back to the palace. They had been out in the forest when all this happened. And these 5 sons now became the ones that would inherit the kingdom. It was a tragic and horrible situation. And there's no way to estimate what it might have felt like for them. On the other hand, we have the blind king, Dhritarashtra. He married Gandhari. Now, because he was blind, her family did not want her to marry this king. But she said no, she's going to marry him. She had a vision that she would be married to a man who was blind. And so she took a vow that she was going to blindfold herself and stay blindfolded for the rest of her life. That was her commitment to the man that she was going to marry. When Gandhari got pregnant, she had a very painful pregnancy that lasted almost 2 years. And she suffered great pain and nightmares about creatures from hell. Finally, when she did give birth, it was not to a person, but to a large lump of putrid flesh. Yeah, it was quite the event. Now, the great sage Vyasa had blessed her and had told her that she will have 100 sons. So when he learnt of this, he immediately rushed over to the palace and he transformed the lump of flesh into 100 sons. When they were born, everyone could see, except the parents, that there was something clearly demonic about these boys. Something totally weird about them. So, this is Vyasa working with that big lump of flesh and turning it into 100 pieces, which then were placed in these jars. And then an oil was placed in those jars, and out of that then emerged the children. Now, yes, fantastic, incredible, sounds like mythology, and that's how it sounded to the British. But the fact of the matter is, these great, highly advanced yogis, highly advanced spiritual beings, had mystical powers that we do not understand in present day time. Today we understand cell phones and the internet and electronics and things like that. Well, they had developed a different kind of ability. If we would show our technology to people at that time, they'd be mystified, as we are mystified when we hear of their technology. They had technology that was gained through meditation, through deep introspection, through going into the different energy fields within us and creating out of that something absolutely phenomenal. Weapons, atomic weapons as well. They knew about time at an atomic level. They understood the nature of the universe in the way that scientists talk about it today. So it's really fascinating to learn about Vedic culture and the kind of incredible things they were doing at that time. Anyway, Vyasa did this incredible thing. And now we have one king, the blind king, having 100 sons. And then we have the sons of Pandu. Pandu has died, and there are 5 sons of Pandu. What was interesting was that both sides, the sons of Dhritarashtra, the blind king, were known as the Kauravas. The Kauravas and the sons of Pandu were known as the Pandavas. So both sides were constantly at fighting with each other. The Kauravas were constantly picking fights with their cousins. And although they were being raised and trained by grandfather Bhishma, and he was constantly trying to get them to get along, yet we find that the fights that were happening even in childhood went on as they got worse as they grew older and older and older. The eldest Kaurava, Duryodhana, was the worst of them all. And the eldest Pandava, Yudhishthira, was the most noble, wise, and kind. So we have a series of situations in which, as they grew older, the Kauravas tried to dethrone to make sure that they never got on the throne, the Pandavas never got on the throne, and to make sure that they could even kill them. The first begins with the drugging of Bhim. Bhim was very strong and powerful. And so when the boys were out sometime playing, Duryodhana, the eldest of the Kauravas, drugged Bhim, tied his hands and legs, and pushed him into a lake which was filled with poisonous snakes. As Bhim fell into the lake, the snakes began to bite him. Bhim, being extremely strong, even as a child, and here we're probably looking at, I'm not sure, but perhaps 8, 10, 12 years old, Bhim broke the ropes, fought the snakes, and came out of the water. And then he acted as if nothing had happened. But now he knew what these people were up to. Duryodhana had hoped to make it look like an accident, as if Bhim just sort of fell in the water and he died of natural causes. But now Bhim knew that this is what had happened, and it was like he was alert, right, to what was going to unfold going forward. This is kind of the scene. I'm sorry that I have to show you things like cartoons like that or little animations, but that's the best I could get to give you an idea. The next incident happened when Duryodhana, that is the eldest of the Kauravas, invited the Pandavas for a vacation. He had them then stay in a palace that was made of flammable material. Of course, the Pandavas didn't know that. Though yes, they were tipped off, but they were being tricked to go and stay in this palace made of flammable material. And the idea was that they would set it on fire while the Pandavas were sleeping. But the Pandavas, the 5 brothers, had been warned. And they managed to, there was an insider person who knew what was going on. And he sent across somebody who would help them dig a tunnel so they could escape in the middle of the night and when the house was being set on fire. So they escaped through that tunnel and they went and hid in the forest and then pretended for a while to be dead. So it made it look like Duryodhana, the eldest Kaurava, had won, and he thought, oh great, I got rid of my enemies and I am now going to be the king. While they were in hiding in the forest, the 5 brothers, the Pandavas, and their mother, Kunti, moved around disguised as Brahmins, lived by begging for food. They also protected the villagers by killing a demon called Bakasura who was harassing them. That's a scene of Bhim. Bhim, again, because he was very powerful and strong, killing that demon. Now, as they wandered through the forest, they've learned about the what was called a swayamvar. A swayamvar is where the woman gets to choose her husband. The father sets up some sort of a difficult thing that only a great warrior who is worthy of his daughter. So the king Draupad had set up a swayamvar, and in this swayamvar there was a huge bow, and that bow had to be picked up and strung, and then the person had to fire it by looking down into a pool of oil while there was a revolving fish going around above, and he had to fire the arrow into the eye of the fish while looking down into the pool of oil. Now, hundreds of princes came from everywhere, including Duryodhan and the Kauravas. And the Pandavas were there, supposedly dead, but they came as Brahmins, dressed in Brahminical robes. A Brahmin is a priest. And so here they were, pretending to be the priestly class as Brahmins, and no one was able to even pick up that bow. What to say of stringing it or firing it? Duryodhan tried, he failed. Others tried, they failed. They couldn't even pick it up. It was so heavy. But then Arjun came along. Arjun was the third of the brothers, of the 5 Pandava brothers, and was a great archer. Arjun picked it up easily, strung it, looked down into the pool of oil, and fired upward right into the eye of the fish. He ended up marrying Draupadi and brought her home along with his brothers to their mother. They were still living in the forest. But now word got out. It was known that the Pandavas, the 5 brothers, and their mother were still alive, that they hadn't died in that fire. And so they were called back to the capital, Hastinapur, or New Delhi as it's now called. And this is the scene from the wedding of the Swayamvar as they're exchanging garlands. So now it was decided by the elders, grandfather Bhishma, their guru Drona. They suggested that the Pandavas be given, the 5 brothers, be given their own land to rule. And so a very barren piece of land that had almost nothing that could grow there, a very completely useless piece of land, was given to them. However, Krishna helped them clear up the land and construct a splendid city called Indraprasth. And now Yudhishthir, the eldest of the Pandav brothers, the 5 brothers, was crowned the king. And in time, his kingdom expanded all over India, and he ruled peacefully for almost a decade before the next incident occurred. Now, I'm really giving you the short version of all of this. There is so much more. There is so much more detail, so much more intricacy. I've tried to make it as simple as possible. But just so you know, I'm really trying to keep it short and give you just the main background of what was going on and what led to the war of Kurukshetra. So the next incident that occurred is when Duryodhan became very envious of the Pandavas' popularity. And he had an uncle called Shakuni. He learned from his uncle that Yudhishthir, the eldest of the Pandavas who had now been crowned king, had a weakness for gambling. And so he challenged Yudhishthir to a game of dice. Gives you a little idea. That's Shakuni on the left and Duryodhan on the right. There's an entire video series that was made on the Mahabharat. And if you want to know where you can find it, I'll let you know. There is also the books of the Mahabharata, and there are interesting videos also on YouTube that you can find. So look for it if you're more interested in getting the detailed version. So as a warrior, Yudhishthir could not refuse a challenge for either fighting or gambling. That was just the code of ethics that Kshatriyas or warriors lived by. He sensed there was going to be some deception. He knew these guys had something up their sleeve. But he had to still go. There was no way. So he was invited. He went. Duryodhana got his uncle Shakuni to play on his behalf. And Shakuni was an incredible cheat. Really good at cheating. And so he cheated and won. Yudhishthir lost his kingdom, his brothers, and himself. And finally he lost his wife, Draupadi. And they were going to make her their slave. That was the intention. This is the Pandavas having lost the brothers themselves. It was just a horrible situation. So having that occur was just so traumatic for everybody. The Kauravas then tried to strip Draupadi in public. She held up her hands in surrender and prayed to Krishna. Her husbands couldn't help her. They had been sold out. They were now slaves of the... This is all happening during the gambling match. Okay, so we're right in that very moment. And so because her husbands couldn't help her, because nobody would help her, and these people had brought her out into the public assembly in the palace, and they were going to take off her clothes now in front of everyone, right? Shame her. She had nowhere to turn, so she raised her hands up in surrender and prayed to Krishna. Krishna, in turn, protected her by sending endless fabric to drape around her. No one was able to remove her clothing. Soon there was the equivalent of 100 saris gathered all around her. And Krishna from a distance was going on sending more and more and more fabric. Eventually the person who was trying to take off her clothes gave up. It was a miracle. And no one could disrobe Draupadi. She had surrendered to Krishna. She had poured out her heart to him and said, only you, my dear beloved, my dear Lord, can save me now. I call on you. And this surrender is a powerful thing to learn about. We'll be talking a lot about it as we study the Bhagavad Gita. Of course, you can imagine the rage and anger of the brothers. Bhim vowed to kill Duryodhana. Arjun swore to kill Karna. They swore that they would end the Kuru dynasty. King Dhritarashtra rebuked his sons, that is the blind king, the father of Duryodhana. To bring peace, he apologized to Draupadi and granted her any wish. She asked for her husbands to be freed, and he agreed. They left, all the 5 brothers, their wife, left the palace of Duryodhana with blood in their eyes and wrath in their hearts. Some days passed, and once again the Kauravas challenged the Pandavas for a final throw of dice. The winner would get the kingdom. The loser would be exiled to the forest for 12 years, and then would have to spend the 13th year hiding in disguise. If they were found during that last 13th year, if they were found out where they were or who they were, because they had to be in disguise and they had to come back from the forest, then they would have to go back into exile for another 12 years. So again, of course, the Kauravas won. Shakuni made sure that they did. And Duryodhana now had complete control of the kingdom. The Pandavas and their wife left for the forest in exile. 13 years passed. They spent the time in the forest, and then the 13th year they stayed in hiding, and no one was able to find them. Once they were back, they tried to negotiate peace. They asked for a bare minimum of 5 villages. If their palace had been taken away, everything had been taken away. They said, all right, doesn't matter. If you will give us just 5 villages so that each of us has one little space that we can rule over, because we are Kshatriyas, we're warriors, we're meant to rule. We will be satisfied and you can have the rest of the entire kingdom. But Duryodhana refused to give them anything. He said, I will not give you so much land as you can put a pin through. He chose instead to go to battle with them. Now, Krishna was the cousin of all these boys, and he was a powerful king himself. He tried everything possible to negotiate peace, but failed. Everything. Just tried all possible ways to negotiate, to appeal to the elders, to try to get them to understand, to make sense. Nothing worked. War became inevitable, and both sides then wanted Krishna's help. They had to choose. And so Krishna gave them this choice. Either you can have my army, and he had a massive army, right, an extremely powerful army, or you can have me, and I will not fight. So either his entire army or him, and he would not fight. This was it was a no-brainer for Duryodhana, who had also. So Duryodhana and Arjuna were both there, asking for Krishna's help. Duryodhana, who was the leader of the Kauravas, chose the army. Oh, of course, he didn't have any faith in Krishna. He didn't believe in Krishna. To him, the army was what he wanted. He was thrilled. And Arjuna, who loved Krishna as his most beloved, chose Krishna. He says, no, I want you, even if you're not going to fight. Krishna said, look, I'm just going to be your chariot driver. I won't even be there as a warrior. I'll just be your chariot driver. Arjuna said, no problem. If I have you, I will have victory. That was his faith. So although the Kauravas were a huge army and the Pandavas were only a much smaller army, even then, despite that, Arjuna chose Krishna. So in the end, the battle of Kurukshetra looked like this. You had on one side grandfather Bhishma, you had Duryodhana and his brothers, 99 brothers, you had Karna, you had their guru Dronacharya, and you had Krishna's army and much more. Many other people joined in the battle. On the other side, the Pandavas, you had Krishna, the 5 brothers, the Pandavas, and the people who joined them. There was a number of people who joined them as well. Now, as we go further, we're going to look at what happened next. So the next part, we're going to look at the actual Bhagavad Gita, because the Bhagavad Gita was spoken on this battlefield. And you'll get to see how it unfolded from there on. So I hope you enjoyed this part of the Mahabharat, the little short, brief summary of the Mahabharat. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video, where we'll talk about the Bhagavad Gita and how that began to be spoken. Have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye. All right. What do you make of that? Can you hear me? Hello, I'm here. Any questions, any comments, any feedback, any thoughts? Anything stand out for you? Okay. It's not letting you unmute. Gotcha. Thanks. Okay, you can unmute yourself now.
Well, I thought it was an interesting lecture, and I want to say thank you. But I was reminded of what was alchemy and the sciences that must be forgotten, the sciences ancient people had, and yeah, like the story of how 100 children were begotten from using clay vases or separating them into 100 pieces. I thought that was pretty alchemical. And the other one about how I think it was Arjuna, and it reminded me of the story of King Arthur,
Yeah.
and how he shot an arrow. He first had to string the bow, and then shoot at a fish's eye. These terms like the arrow, the bow, the fish, foil, all these things are I've read about, or these symbols being largely used in alchemical literature.
Were they there in the story of King Arthur as well? Ooh.
Well, I'm reminded of that story because of the sword being in the stone and nobody could get it out other than King Arthur.
Ah, okay. I got it. Okay. Yeah, it's quite amazing how these things are linked together. But there's so many little stories that parallel together, and it's quite fascinating when you start to hear them. Anyone else want to share something?
Just that I appreciate the introduction. It was very welcomed.
Thank you.
Yes, I have to thank you. This was wonderful to step into this container in this way. Do you have a question? I think I've, collected bits and pieces of all these stories or not stories, but
Histories, perhaps.
yes.
Yes.
I'm a little confused. Are the demigods and the Devas,
Mhm.
are they the same? Are they
Same.
interchangeable
Yes, that's
words?
just an English word, demigod, and the original Sanskrit word is deva.
Devas. Okay.
Yeah. And so you
Gotcha.
hear of this a lot in the yoga community, especially where they talk about Ganesh and they talk about so many different, but those are all devas. They're not. So a lot of people think that Hinduism has many gods. It has many demigods. But when it comes to God, it doesn't have many gods. It has one God. So it's monotheistic and polytheistic simultaneously. All right. It also believes that in what is the other term where you see God in nature, right? There's a term for that as well. I know Wordsworth and some of these poets, that was how they saw God, was in nature. There's a term for that. Pardon?
I think it's animist. Is that what you're referring to?
What is
animist?
it? Animist. No.
Animistic, or referring to something else?
Are you talking about nature spirits like leprechauns and?
Yeah, those would be there. But I'm trying to get at how there are people who believe that nature is God. There are people who believe the universe is God. And the Vedas, they combine all these concepts together as one and see them as totally interconnected. That God is a being and simultaneously in everyone and simultaneously everywhere. So it doesn't become an either or. They don't go by either or philosophies. They rather go by the idea that things can be both and more.
Mm-hmm. One other thing, did I catch this correctly that like the Trinity, the Brahman, the Vishnu, the Shiva, they are they were all people, or they were all?
Yes, they're beings just like you and I, except that they're highly evolved beings. And being highly evolved beings, they also have incredibly developed mystical powers to do things, for example, to create an entire universe. They're given that ability to do that, right? And they would have attained to that state through their meditations, through their process, but they haven't yet perfected. They haven't come to the point of absolute enlightenment. So they are still caught in the cycle of birth and death. They have much longer lifespans. They live on other planets. So you could really call them alien beings. And they're considered to be more beautiful. They're considered to have, not suffer the way we do on Earth. Earth is considered like the middle planet. So we have sort of an equal amount of suffering and happiness. There, in so-called heavenly planets, you have much greater happiness. There are hellish planets where there's greater levels of unhappiness or suffering. But there's no such thing as like a hell like the Christian Bible talks about, right? So the Devas live in the heavenly planets. There are other beings who are not Devas also who live there. And they enjoy a wonderful lifetime. Brahma's life must span for billions of years according to the Vedas. They actually break it down. I forget the math of it all. It's too much. But it's all there. They talk in terms of time broken down to a subatomic level. They talk about the soul, in terms of dimensions that are infinitesimal. And they actually quantify that. So it's quite fascinating, the kind of culture and technologies they had at that time. There are weapons they talk of where they could fire an arrow that could land on one person and create the equivalent of a nuclear blast, but only right there, localized. And when they describe what that blast looks like, the same fusing of the earth and stuff that you hear about in a nuclear blast would occur, but in a small zone that would not, it would not. So this was called the Brahmastra. It could destroy an entire planet, or it could destroy a single individual. And it was done through the chanting of mantras and the firing of arrows. Now, one could just completely dismiss it or say, well, we don't know. Because they talk of Vimana. Vimana is the airplanes, right? Ram came back from his time in Sri Lanka back to the north of India in an airplane. A flower airplane is what they talk about.
I want one.
It certainly didn't have any pollutants and it didn't use gasoline.
Sure.
Right? So, yeah. Now, did they have these technologies? According to many people, they did. There's a lot of evidence that they had the ability. The Viman Shastra that are there in the Vedas, they give detailed plans for... Oh, seem to have frozen here.
No, we can still hear you.
You see me? All right. Okay. So they have detailed plans, like how to construct such an egg. Well, those materials are not necessarily available to us right now, but and some of the implications of what they were trying to say are not very clear. But they believed that you could actually create airplanes like that. Anyways, it's a really fascinating study. And the Mahabharata is available if you're interested in reading further. You'll find it in many different ways. You'll find that there's videos, you'll find books, you'll find all kinds of resources. It seems like I'm not able to get back my original camera.
At least we can see you on this video.
You're able to see me? Yeah, I switched to a different camera just so you can.
It stopped again, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. In any case, we need to wind up. So we're going to continue every week on Tuesdays. And at that time, I hope you guys will make it because we're going to now begin now we begin the Bhagavad Gita itself. So the first, the next meeting, we're going to talk about the first chapter, which is Arjun's dilemma, where he does not want to fight in the battle. So be there. And then from there, you'll begin to understand the philosophy of the Gita. By the way, in case you can't make it, I do have all of this on YouTube, and so you can watch it there as well. My YouTube channel is Spiritual Wisdom Channel, and you can watch even the previous recordings that are there and the ones to come. We're going to try to cover one chapter every week, which will be sort of summing it up, because there's actually a lot. We did the entire Bhagavad Gita in a period of 2 years earlier. Now we'll do it probably in a matter of 4 months.
Okay.
So be there, and we're going to have some very interesting discussions. All right, guys, take care. Thank you so much for being here today. We do have another meetup that begins in a little bit. And in that, this one is about relationships.